Hello, hello. Welcome to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast, the podcast for women of color who are daughters of immigrants to feel seen, heard, and validated. My name is Nancy Diaz, and I am a trauma-informed therapist, speaker, and your podcast host today. And now, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Nancy Diaz, and today we have a very special guest. We have Chantelle Bacigalupo joining us, and she is the daughter of immigrants, and we're going to talk about all things sex today and just share our insights as daughters of immigrants, what our experiences have been like, and answer some questions that are commonly Googled and debunk some myths and misconceptions. So let's get into it. Chantelle, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. I can't wait to talk about this topic because I did not talk about it a lot growing up. So it's good to be here.
Yes, amazing, right? Healing that inner child, that inner teenager that was like, ooh, what do we do here? How do we figure all this stuff out when no one talks about these things? So yes, thank you so much for being here. So do you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background? Please share with us.
My parents are from Bolivia. So I grew up in Texas. I'm Bolivian-American, and I grew up going to Catholic school my whole life. So from like 4 years old to 18. And then I left after 18. I didn't go to Catholic university or anything. But that was such a strong foundation to, how I viewed life in general, but also obviously, sex and the relationship to my body. And so this topic is one that has taken so much time and continues to just there's so many layers. There's so much that I have to take off and reframe to just feel good. And it's just so proud and juicy to be a woman.
Yes, I love it. Yeah. We have become empowered women. So let's talk a bit about that. So tell us a little bit about some of these myths and misconceptions. What are some of the things that you heard when you were growing up about sex, either from family, from the culture, from society, from people in Catholic school, teachers? What are some of the wildest things that you heard that you were told about sex?
It's so funny. I've worked so hard to undo so much of this that it's I have to kind of go back for a second. It's really beautiful because I'm I've actually come a really long way, that it's taking me a hot minute to go back. But I would say, it might not be that wild for a lot of people, but obviously you're a terrible person if you have sex out of wedlock. You're gonna go to hell. You're it's in communion with the devil kind of thing. And just wild things if you sit on a toilet seat, you're gonna get pregnant.
I was going to mention that one.
But sexual. I was am I gonna say this one out loud? Am I gonna say that I believed this for a minute in my life?
I think we all did.
Every once in a while I'm am I actually gonna sit on this toilet seat?
Yeah, my mom was very much do not ever sit on the toilet seat.
I know. And that's why you got to use protection and use those little paper toilet seat covers, so that you don't get pregnant, folks.
And in case anyone is wondering, this is all a joke. You do not get pregnant from
do not try.
Just disclaimer there. In case anyone is oh, I hadn't heard that one before. Is that true? No, it's a myth. You not get pregnant. Are there any others that come to mind?
Yeah, I actually want to share one that has been a big one, and it's adjacent to sex. It's the concept of pleasure, and pleasure just being terrible. It just carried such a negative connotation for me, so much so that when we had teachers who would say, we are going to take the afternoon today to read for pleasure, which meant that you get to choose a book that's not required for your school. That when I would hear that, it actually physically made me contract. And I always was like, why are they using that word to talk about reading? Like, that's a bad word. Why would they like,
Ooh,
and it stuck with
interesting.
me for a while that I had to really rewire my brain into understanding that pleasure is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Pleasure is something that I'm worthy of, that I deserve, that I am.
Yeah.
And like I can continue to kind of embody that in how I walk through life. But wow, I mean, I think back to sixth grade Chantelle, who would just cringe at teachers who said that word in front of me. And was like, we talk about this all day, like pleasure is bad, and now you're telling me to read a book for pleasure? Like, giving me mixed signals here.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit and
Yeah.
figure out where does that come from. So what were you told about pleasure before people told you to read for pleasure?
Was I told? That's a great question.
Sometimes it's all this hidden messaging. No one actually has to say anything, but we just somehow know that it's bad, that it's so taboo that we
Like
can't pleasure ourselves, that we can't talk about it, much less talk about it.
it's like it leads to something terrible. Like if you ever even play with the idea of pleasure, it leads to not good things. And you're not like a respectable woman if you are associated with pleasure in any way. You're not a trusted woman if
Mm.
you're associated with pleasure in any way.
So it
It's
probably
really
comes from
deep. And
being a good girl and then that training to be a good woman. And good girls don't do that.
Totally,
Good women don't do that because we're taught to
that is
abstain from all of it, right?
that's a
All
beautiful
forms of
way
sex.
to synthesize.
Did you ever hear about
Definitely.
the misconception, because this is quite common, I think, within like Catholic community of, oh, if it's through the back, then you're still a virgin.
Yes, I've heard that, but I didn't subscribe to it. I think I was just like, it's all bad.
It's all bad.
From
Yeah,
the
yeah.
front,
There
from
were
the
there
back,
were
it's
people
all
that were like, no, it's all bad, and there were definitely some people that were like, no, this is a loophole. So that's another
bad.
misconception too, right? And a myth of what even is virginity. Virginity is just a social construct, but definitely I think when we're raised Catholic, and I imagine I didn't go to a Catholic school, but I imagine it's probably even worse with the Catholic school of, you have to remain a virgin until you get married. And yeah, being a virgin is very clear, what it looks like, what it's supposed to be.
Mind you, I have friends who waited till marriage before having sex, which is not the path that I took. Um, and beautifully, they don't carry shame in the way that they express it. It's for them, at least, it has been something that feels very true to what their beliefs are, but they don't feel the need to project it on others. And I think that's why I've been able to remain some sense of friendship with them.
Yeah.
But something, because of a lot of these misconceptions, I often think about how when we're growing up and when we're in really vulnerable situations as teenagers, when we're like exploring our sexuality, you want to talk about it with your friends. And when you're raised as a community to know that this is all bad, to think that it's all bad, not know, you don't have that community to lean on. And I often found that because when we were talking about losing your virginity, I think I was the only friend in my group that had a boyfriend at the time, and it was senior prom. And they
Mm,
were like, oh, is she, she's been dating him for 2 years now, like is she gonna lose her virginity to him on prom? But it wasn't done with excitement. It wasn't done with how exciting, like a rite of passage, like how romantic on senior prom. It was done with judgment. Like, is
judgment.
she gonna
Yeah.
lose her virginity to him? And
And
there
how
was
common is slut shaming? So
and these were
common.
my best friends. These
Yeah.
were my best friends. And I've had to really do my own inner work to kind of just come to terms with the phase of life that we were in, the different paths that we were all took. We're still in each other's lives. And we've come to really respect all the different paths we took and have this kind of beautiful, eclectic group of friends that were like, man, if we hadn't met each other in childhood, I don't know that we would be friends right now because we're all went very different directions.
Yeah.
But That's I think the part that makes me the saddest about creating spaces of shame around sex for teenage girls is we just don't have anyone to talk to about it. And that just puts us in really vulnerable situations where we could take the wrong turn.
Yeah, definitely. We're not taught to feel empowered, to explore our own bodies, to just allow any kind of pleasure. Like you said, I mean, that was such a beautiful, perfect example of you were taught that pleasure was bad and then you couldn't. And that's such an interesting way of thinking about it because I hadn't even thought of it this way. But so many of us struggle when it comes to self-care, when it comes to tuning into our own needs, tuning into our body's needs, our soul's needs. But yeah, how much of it does stem from we've been shamed for so long to think that pleasure is something bad. And so now that might be creeping into other areas of our life still, because we're still, you know, this is a lifelong journey. We're still doing that really hard work to unlearn so much of that because for so long, for so many years, I mean, you were in Catholic school for such a long time. And that is so many years of being told again and again that pleasure is something bad. And so how have you kind of come to that moment of thinking, okay, pleasure is not bad. And there are so many benefits now to giving myself pleasure. How did you get there? What has that journey been like for you?
The first thing I did was after I graduated high school, I chose a university, I think subconsciously, that was the absolute opposite of my upbringing. And it was a very drastic change. It was incredibly liberal in its expression of like sex and a lot of taboo topics, which I think my being really needed to remind me that there's a completely other reality. And it was tough because, I mean, the people surrounding me talked about sex so graphically, like
Yeah.
in detail. Like
Yeah.
it was como nada.
Mm-hmm.
That they used to laugh at me freshman year because they would come back, you know, from whatever sexcapade they had, and they would, you know, be in dorm rooms and they'd be just like chatting about their experience. And I, without knowing, was literally contracted in a ball with a pillow around me, like hearing everything. And they would be like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, no, yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine. But it was so new. And so I really made an effort because there was something deep inside of me that was like, I know that there's more. And so I'm going to sit through the discomfort to as much like as while I still feel safe, um, to explore the edges of this. And so it's kind of been that process. I think the downside of growing up in an environment where you've been so repressed sexually and you don't have sufficient education or tools to navigate that part of yourself, that pushing the envelope and exploration of it did lead me in directions that were not safe, and I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
And I think that that is one of the saddest things about not having like safe spaces to talk about it, because that's what happens. You know, you're like, I want to explore this part of myself.
And you don't know how to
I
do it
went in the wrong.
safely. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no. And so I think it's been a beautiful journey. I think the part in a hard one as well, but that's part of the process. I think the part about pleasure though that's the most beautiful is when I can allow myself to feel pleasure in whatever way, whether it's like with myself or with someone else, or just like eating food, like any pleasurable experience, like the sheepskin rug in my home right now, like it feels incredibly expansive. And I think for people who feel like the topic of pleasure and sex is so far from them, like those small sensory things are
Yeah.
such a safe entry point. The smell of your tea, like the warmth of the candle, like just really small things are ways to tap into pleasure where it doesn't feel like scary and dangerous because they've made us programmed us to think that that's what it is. So that's been for me in the last couple of years, like how I've been trying to reconnect to it in a way that feels safer, is
Yeah.
like, how can I just do it in everyday life, in my
Yeah.
everyday life, so that when that experience comes in a different way, I'm like, I can trust myself. I I really can listen to my body. So
Yes.
I
Yeah.
love the journey.
The journey, yes, it's one that's definitely worth going on. I say that all the time, that it's a hard one, it's a long one, it's lifelong, but it's there's also so much beauty in it, and just me being able to start small, like you said, I think that's amazing. And I've been doing that too. And my friend and I were actually talking about this yesterday, about how
Mm,
this year, like I really noticed, like I'm connected with that sense of smell even, and just taking the time to literally slow down and smell the flowers. There's no roses here, but I'm just
mm.
always walking around and I'm like, how did I never notice this? Like these trees, these flowers were around last year, this time of year, just the same, but I never noticed it. And she's like, I don't
Wow.
notice a smell from those trees. And I was like, I didn't notice it either. I was like, isn't it insane? The more that we actually start to slow down, connect with ourselves, and just realize, like, wow, yeah, like more that you intentionally connect with your senses. Yeah, you're right. It is about that pleasure. And every morning when I do my daily gratitude meditation, it says, be grateful for your sense of smell, for your eyesight, right? For your ears, being able to hear. And I'm like, that is so beautiful. What are the sounds that I love to hear? I love to hear music. I love to hear like your voice right now, having this beautiful conversation. Be grateful for your voice, like be grateful for taste. I'm like, I'm such a big foodie. I love food. I'm like, I'm so grateful for like this like awesome burrito that I made myself this week, and just you're right. It is connected to pleasure. And I hadn't even thought of it that way, but I was like, yeah, when I am thinking about being grateful for my senses, that's it. I'm being grateful that I'm allowed to experience so many different types of pleasure through those senses. And I think you're right. That's such a beautiful way of starting small, especially because for so many of us, this can feel really overwhelming to connect with pleasure.
Mm,
And I think that that's a really nice way of starting small. And like you said, like if it's, touch, and touch has always been something so taboo for us, something that you're not supposed to
mhm,
do, you're not supposed to touch yourself. And so any kind of touch that feels good, even like you said, like the sheepskin rug, that might be something that we subconsciously avoid because we're like, no, 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 I can't just be rubbing this rug even if it feels nice. Like that will lead to temptation, that will lead to sin. I mean, if we've been conditioned to think that for so long, then yeah, we avoid. And our bodies, like you said, we notice it in our bodies that we just pull away, and we don't want that. So I think that that's a beautiful way of just starting small and exploring. And I know that that's something that sexologists and sex therapists recommend, is just starting small and just allowing yourself to really explore, but in a safe, gentle way. Starting small, I think, is so underrated. We always think that we have to go right into it, and usually that's not the case. It doesn't feel safe for everyone.
and sometimes it's like re-traumatizing because it's like,
Mhm.
oh, that's what they said this was, it's just cada uno a su tiempo. Feels
Yeah.
so good. Also, I wanted to ask, was there anything that changed in your life that led to you all of a sudden feeling really connected to your senses?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that for me, it's just been like a really natural kind of progression. The more that I do this type of work, the more, I mean, definitely, I think the meditation really helped because I had never thought about my senses, really. I had never thought, like, oh, wow, like, yeah, I am grateful, for being able to like pet a cat and that feels so nice, or like, yeah, like being able to pleasure myself and like, wow, that touch feels so good. And I know, like, when I did my first religion and sexuality course in college, because I think similar to you, I was like, oh
Oh,
my
wow.
God, like this is so cool that this exists. And I'm definitely like, I like ran to that class, like signed up right away. And we learned about, female genital mutilation, and how in so many countries that's literally ripped apart and taken away from women because the pleasure is something that's so bad that they remove the entire clitoris so that women can't experience pleasure. And so I think, like, oh my God, I got chills just thinking about that because it was really hard and really heavy to learn about this. But as I started continuing
Is
this
there
work, like that
literally
kept coming up. Yeah. Yeah.
they're literally physically removing the
Yeah.
temptation. They're
Yeah.
like,
I mean,
we just need to physically take it out of
yeah.
that. Wow, that's a
Yeah.
very strong thing to look at.
Yeah. And it made me, realize like, wow, I have to be grateful that I even have those parts, that I feel
Oh,
good in being able to pleasure myself. It's so good for our mental health. And yeah, this journey has been evolving, but now the more I think about it, and I think I've known for years the benefits of orgasm, and yet still there was something in my own journey that I was like, yeah, I know it's good for me. Yeah, I know I should probably do it more. Yeah, I don't know, like maybe later, maybe later. And you don't prioritize it the same way you prioritize, I don't know, drinking water, doing
mhm.
yoga, or and when you prioritize all these other things, when that actually has so many mental health benefits as well, and physical health benefits too, better sleep. I mean, and yet we see like men have no issues. Like, how many men do we know that they're like, oh yeah, like I masturbate before going to bed because I get way better sleep, you know? Like, I've known men who have told me that, and I'm like, wow, like
No way.
that's so normal. Like, okay, that's so great, like that you do that. And like, yeah, they're so open about, their consumption of porn, of masturbation.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think I've shared this in another episode, but when I had my, oh God, what class was it? I think it was my intro to sociology class, when they had us write on one side of the board all the different ways that there are of saying masturbation for men. And then they had us write on the other side of the board masturbation for women. And same thing with, oh my God, it was just insane when you think about, okay, how do you say like going down for men and going down for women? There's like not that many terms. We filled
Wow,
the
I hadn't
board on the
thought about
left
that.
side for men, and there was like two that we could think of for women:
Wow.
carpet munching, and I can't remember what the other one was, but some obscure one that I was like, oh, okay, but two. And on the other side, so many different terms for blowjob. And I was like, wow, if that doesn't tell us something, that it's just so normal in our society for men to receive pleasure, give themselves pleasure. And yet for women, it's so taboo that we don't even have the terms to describe it. So few terms. And I think now, since I've
Right.
taken that class, luckily I think there are more and more people are talking about it, and we're owning our sexuality. I think it's beautiful, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, we still have so far to go. And sometimes it does feel like we take one step forward and two steps back. I mean, just abortion,
Right.
like there's just so much that I just think like, wow, we think we're going forward and then we go back, and yeah, it is insane. I took
I
like a long
know.
detour
I
to that
like to,
answer.
no, I love it. I love it. I feel like it's such a potent time right now to be like someone with a uterus and a vagina. Like truly, it feels like we're really reclaiming a lot of it. And I often think about when we feel like it's taking two steps back. I like often, I'm sure you've heard of this, like the spiral of healing, where it's
Yeah.
like it feels like you're in the same place, but really you're not, you're like kind of in an elevated place. I try and look at it like that because I'm like, okay, damn, mi abuela, what I'm facing right now, like, gracias a todos sus rezos.
Yes.
Because I'm like, this,
Yeah, thanks to her.
there's a lot of abundance and there's still so much work to do that I hope that we can just continue to plant like little seeds for our granddaughters.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, people are looking at us, seeing what we're doing, what we're talking about, and they're saying, "Oh, wow, like it's okay to talk about these things. It's okay to feel these things, to experience these things." And yeah, whether we have daughters or not, I think that people
Yeah.
are watching us. And now with social media, I mean, even just doing this episode, I
I
keep
was
saying
gonna
like
say
this
this
is,
podcast
yeah, so
alone.
healing for our inner childs to just be like, wow, like you get to talk about that. You get to talk about everything that you were feeling back then, everything that you thought. I mean, these questions that people are Googling, it just made me so sad to realize, should I feel guilty for having a boyfriend? Should I feel
Mhm.
ashamed of my body? Should I feel bad for having a one night stand? Like, these are questions that are commonly Googled. And there's just so much shame. And that just keeps coming up again and again. And all these questions, I probably have like 20 questions in front of me. Is it normal to not have sex? is it normal to not want kids? Am I supposed to like kissing? Is sex supposed to be fun? There's just so many questions that you're right. Like going back to what you said earlier about there's not the education that we need. And so then we don't feel safe and we end up in unsafe situations. So having conversations like this on the podcast are so important. And there are so many people that don't understand. So I told someone that I have this podcast, and they looked up the podcast, and they laughed when they saw one of the episodes. Its title is Sex Bad, and they thought it was funny. And I was like, it's funny to some people, but I'm like, unfortunately, like that is a very real question that so many people have, young people, but even like I know women, that are even older than me that still think that sex is bad, and they don't talk about it. They don't talk about pleasure. They don't talk about any of this because there's still so much healing that they haven't done yet. And unfortunately, I think that so many of us, like I mentioned before, we don't even see the importance of it. We don't even see the connection, how it's connected to our physical health, to our mental health. And there's still not enough people talking about it. And that's why I wanted to bring this whole season to talk about these things and really try to help people understand there's so much connection.
Oh my God, is it the
in
whole
all of it.
season?
Yeah, it's a whole season. Yeah. It's a whole
I
season.
love that. I didn't realize it was a whole season. I hope it's multiple seasons. We need a lot of conversation.
I mean, from this, it's turned into some beautiful collaborations and partnerships with sexologists, and just trying to
Yeah.
bring this education to daughters of immigrants, because it's so needed. I mean, the fact that there are these questions that exist and that are still being asked to this day. I'm just trying to do my small part to break that taboo, because yeah, there's so much education that is still missing. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the education that you received, some of the things that you saw were lacking in Catholic school education?
I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I remember is that it only showed you how to have, like, what sex was about if you were married. And so it was about procreation.
Oh,
And
they taught you how to make babies.
that was they taught you how to make babies, and they taught you that once you get married, this is what sex is, and this is to make babies. But it did not include, like, this is what sex is. People can have it before they get married. This is what you do to, stay safe. Also, this is what's not okay if someone does to you, whatever is unsafe, whether it's like
consent,
someone that's older than you. Yeah, consent, all of that. See, I don't even have the right terminology.
Yeah.
So it was really lacking. And I feel like I really feel for a lot of us who just don't have even the proper terminology to even express what we desire.
Yeah.
Like, first and foremost, as people, like pleasurable beings, what it is that we want to feel good. Also, what we don't want, what's not okay, boundaries. I mean, so I did go to 1 year where I wasn't in Catholic school, and I was 12 years old, and I didn't get the sex ed class because for some reason the time that I was there, they didn't put me in it, which I was bummed about, honestly. But I remember the kids who were in the class who were coming out, and they were talking about how they saw a birth video. They were talking about condoms. They were talking about birth control. That was really my only interaction with it until I went to college, was like hearing secondhand kids who did the sex ed class.
And it's so funny that you brought up the birth video, because now living in Australia, whenever I tell people about that, the birth video, they're like, what? Why would you, what's the point of that? And I'm like, well, the point is to scare us. Like, that's very much, that's the point, and I think, like, I went to school in Phoenix, and super conservative. And so I'm like, okay, they're not telling us not to have sex before marriage, but just showing us that video. I'm like, I never realized how wild that was until you go somewhere else and they're like, what? That is shocking. Why would they show you that? That's so not necessary for kids to see. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It was kind of like a running joke of like, yeah, like this is what you don't want. Like
The birth
don't have
video.
sex because this is what's gonna happen, and I was like, interesting. But I find it even more interesting because I didn't know that in Catholic school they did teach you about sex. I would have assumed that it just was like no one would talk about it at all. Because for me, growing up with my mom, who's very like strict Catholic, like she definitely, I don't think I've ever heard her say the word sex. Like, and she even has to whisper the word bra and like period. I've never heard her say period, and it's some like all of this is so taboo that she would just have a heart attack if she knew that I was doing this podcast this season and talking about all these things openly and breaking down the shame for myself and for so many other people because it was something so taboo. And so I think I always just assume like, okay, if you go to Catholic school, like this is, I guess, what you're taught. And not that she didn't make it very far in school because of economic circumstances and things like that, but I think I just would have assumed like if you go to Catholic school, it's probably like that, like very hush hush. They don't talk about it at all. But very interesting that they do talk about it, but only to, okay, this is how you make a baby.
I know,
This is how you do it.
at least in high school, yes. Make more Catholic babies.
More Catholic babies. Yeah. Wow. That is so interesting. Yeah.
I am no longer in the Catholic Church, but God bless them.
Yeah. 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 Same here. But yeah, it is very wild. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I think that it has been super enlightening and just a pleasure to have you on the podcast talking about these things, breaking down so many stigmas, I think. And yeah, thank you so much.
Honestly, thank you for creating a space where me and so many other of the guests that you're going to have an opportunity to really talk about this, because even for me and for us who are speaking, it's incredibly healing to be able to like choose to say these things out loud and like let it come out, because a lot of it is about staying silent. And if we can actually just find the safe space to say it out loud, gracias. So thank you so much for creating this space.
Amazing. I'm glad it was helpful and healing for both of us. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, I am here to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you because you are not alone. If you want to support this podcast, please make sure to leave a review so others can find it as well. If you're interested in working with me, you can find me at www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And if you'd like to heal your relationship with self-care and learn more about how to find the type of soul care that works for you, you can find the link to my workshop in the description of this podcast episode. Thank you again, and see you next time.